Time to preview the biggest game of the week, the look-ahead focus. Landis, you said you're as excited for this Penn State-Michigan game as any game of the season.
Yeah, it's mostly about Michigan and wanting to see what they're actually about this year because I think Penn State's very good, and Michigan has to go on the road and play in the Beaver Stadium environment. It's not a late game, unfortunately. It is a big noon kickoff, which I don't know. I didn't really feel like that took away from the Ohio State Penn State game all that much last year. Did you? Like, I thought it was still pretty raucous, even though it wasn't a nighttime game.
Yeah, Beaver Stadium can bring it.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it gets spooky and scary at night, but it's still loud and intimidating during the day.
Yeah. So, and that'll be the case for this game too. And I also like it's a spot for Penn State to, bounce back from a tough outing against Ohio State because I think they're better than what they showed against Ohio State, and now they're back at home, so they should be able to show some better form in this one.
So this is a noon kick on Fox. I think it opened at 5.5. It's down to 4.5 as we record. That Michigan is favored. It's a road favorite. I think it's interesting, this triumvirate, right? That the three best teams in the Big Ten. We know what Ohio State, Michigan is. It's defining for those two programs. It's defining in college football. The Ohio State Penn State relationship has been Penn State can't get over the hump. Like Penn State can't be Ohio State, right? And that's sort of what that story is. It goes back several years of James Franklin being like, listen, like this is elite. This is a defining thing. Like we've got to get here. And like they just they play tough, but they don't get over the top. Michigan Penn State is so interesting to me because I think Penn State must look at Michigan and think they can do it. We can do it. And so when you look at James Franklin and Jim Harbaugh, James Franklin is in year 10. Jim Harbaugh is in year 9. Jim Harbaugh is 5-3 against Penn State. James Franklin is 3-6 against Michigan. Michigan won last year overall. Harbaugh's record is better, 83-25 overall. James Franklin is 86-37. It's not a huge gulf, Landis, but I think, definitively, especially with what Michigan has become the last 2 years, they're ahead of Penn State, but I don't think it feels unattainable for Penn State to copy what Michigan has done. But to start that, they have to beat Michigan on Saturday.
Yeah, they have to be, perhaps even more importantly, they have to be competitive because they weren't last year. Like if you're feeling one way as a Penn State fan about the Ohio State matchup, and you should, if there was a little part of you that was like worried about the Michigan matchup moving in a similar direction based off how lopsided last year's game was and like how the two programs are situated currently, like I wouldn't fault you for that. So obviously a win erases all of that, but if this is another Penn State gets run off the field against Michigan, then that puts James Franklin in a really, really tough spot, I think.
It does. Both pretty dominant, right? That Michigan hasn't really played anybody yet, and Penn State has a loss to Ohio State, but doesn't really have a defining win yet. Mm-hmm. I mean, it would be West Virginia, right?
Yeah, it has wins that have aged fairly well against West Virginia and Iowa.
So, but they both have been dominant in raw stats on both sides of the ball. Offensively, Michigan scoring almost 41 points a game. Penn State scoring just over 40 points a game. They are 5th and 6th in the nation in points per game. And then defensively, Michigan's not even giving up a touchdown a game, man. Like it's ridiculous. 6.7 points per game scoring defense. That's 1st in the nation. Penn State, 11.9. That's 3rd in the nation. And again, I think for both these teams, though, and point taken on Iowa and West Virginia, Michigan hasn't played two teams that good. But they both just are smothering the opposition for the most part. But you're not exactly sure what it means. We have the Penn State game against Ohio State that gave us some information. But I also think they've both been trapped a little bit in a world where some people don't want to give them that much respect because they don't have any great wins. Mm-hmm. But I do think you have to acknowledge that they are just like taking people apart, man.
Yeah, Michigan's first in game control. However ESPN measures it, Michigan's first. Penn State is 6th. So they've both like kind of handled their business. Ohio State, if you care, is 3rd. The thing with Penn State is like not only does it have the loss, but like it followed it up by like nearly losing to Indiana.
They did.
That's the one thing that Michigan has not done. Like Michigan we can be really nitpicky and like question how dominant were you against Purdue compared to the other wins, but like they still kick Purdue's butt, and they have not really messed around with anybody, and that makes them different than Penn State. But they have not had to play a game like this yet, so we'll see what that looks like when they finally do. But I think that is a separating factor. Is like Michigan has been so clearly dominant in every single game it's played, and Penn State like lost to Ohio State, messed around with Indiana, was like kind of weird with Northwestern in the first half of that game. Like there's been a little more chinks in that armor, I think.
Shorthand for Penn State has been like run on them, right? Smaller defensive tackles. Last year, it was a close game early, and then Michigan just steamrolled Penn State in the second half. You have talked this year. Michigan is not running it as much. They were like 5th in the nation in rushing yards per game last year. This year, they're in the 50s. Is part of it is because they have much more of a passing identity with J.J. McCarthy, where last year it felt like they had to run because they couldn't rely on the pass game. But do you think there's a chance Michigan leans on Penn State in this one, or is it that not how it's going to go? Like just run all over them all day?
No, I mean I could still see it, and it's partly for Penn State. Like prove it to me before I just assume you're there. They gave up 146 rushing yards to West Virginia in the opener, but it was only 3.5 yards per carry. Like that's a pretty solid rushing team. It's held every other team under 100 yards, and 7 of those 8 teams they've held under 3 yards per carry. Michigan ran for 418 yards in this game last year.
Yeah.
But as you said, they are very different. Michigan last year averaged 239 per game and 5.5 per carry. This year they're 167 per game and 4.5 per carry, which I think is the second lowest total it's had under Harbaugh, maybe the third lowest total yards per carry it's had since Harbaugh has been there. So it's different. And I think like Michigan's offensive line, and I have another point I want to make about that, is pretty good this year. Maybe it's not quite as good as it was last year and the year before. So I think it's unlikely that Michigan does again what it did to Penn State last year, but Penn State was in a similar position last year too. Like they had a statistically very good rushing defense all of last year until it played Michigan, and then it was exposed and got ran into the ground. So I think that's still possible this time.
It did feel like though when I was, and again, I picked Penn State to beat Ohio State because I thought Penn State matched up better with Ohio State than it did with Michigan. So they are going to have to stand up to this, but you are very intrigued by this Penn State defensive line against this Michigan offensive line. And I don't know, maybe it got underplayed in the Penn State-Ohio State game that Chop Robinson, who is viewed as a first-round draft pick potentially, left that game, certainly affected Penn State, and he's a maybe to be back for this one?
Yeah, so he got hurt in that game. I think he only ended up playing like 14 snaps against Ohio State. He got hurt in that game, hasn't played since. He traveled to Maryland and he warmed up, I think like in pads, and then he didn't play in that game. And James Franklin said afterward, like having him go through that process to like show that he can warm up and run and cut and not feel any discomfort is part of the rehab plan. So like I think he checked that box, and now I would assume the next box is, can he go play in a game? So I think he'll probably give it a go against Michigan. And then they also have Denai Dennis Sutton, and they have Adisa Isaac, and that's 3 really good pass rushers that are among the best in the country. And then like didn't really have much of an impact on the Ohio State game. I thought they would, so it's certainly possible they don't this year. One stat that was interesting to me is like Pro Football Focus has this pass blocking efficiency metric, and Michigan's 129th in the country. Now the discrepancy between like 1 and 1, it's not, there's not a tremendous gap there. But it's worse than it was last year. And I don't know that Michigan's tackles are excellent. I think they're okay. Ladarius Henderson, the transfer from Arizona State, and Carson Barnhart are 2 tackles. I don't think they're as good a tackle as they were the last 2 years. The middle of that offensive line, I think, is very good. Drake Nugent and Zach Zinter are among the 2 best interior offensive linemen in the country. But I am wondering if maybe Penn State can be had, or not Penn State, if Michigan can be had a little bit at the tackle position with this group of pass rushers, assuming that Chop Robinson is able to give it a go and is some semblance of himself after having not played for 2.5 weeks.
Does this game come down to whether Penn State can throw the ball, to whether Drew Allar can do anything? We've been talking a lot about Kyle McCord at Ohio State, and I think we've fallen into a agreement that Kyle McCord in year 1 at Ohio State is similar to J.J. McCarthy in year 1 at Michigan last year, and now you see J.J. McCarthy making a huge leap in year 2. I think Drew Allar probably could fall into that as well, right? You're getting year one Drew Allar, and you look at JJ McCarthy and think, oh man, maybe he'll make that leap next year. I thought maybe in the Ohio State game, Drew Allar would come out and throw the ball. He was 18 of 42, and like it did not go well. He's been like, again, they almost lost to Indiana. He was 20 of 31, 3 touchdowns in the pick against Indiana. Last week against Maryland, he's 25 of 34 for 4 touchdowns, no picks. So the last 2 games, 7 touchdowns, 1 pick. His average depth of target is up from where it was earlier in the year, right? So they're letting him throw the ball down the field more. And again, PFF tracks big time throws where it's just like you kind of know it when you see it. In the first 7 weeks of the season, that includes the Ohio State game, he had 4 total big time throws in 7 weeks. He has 5 in the last 2 weeks. So if he has made progress since the Ohio State game, with his ability to hit some stuff down the field, with Penn State calling it, with the receivers getting open, then I think Penn State has a chance. If it looks like it did against Ohio State, then I think Penn State has no chance. Do you believe that the Penn State passing game has made progress the last couple weeks?
Can I correct myself before I answer that real quick? So that pass blocking efficiency metric I just gave you, I didn't realize when I was looking at the teams that like PFF has like everyone who's played a game that it tracks. In the FBS, Michigan is 55th, but they were 29th last year, so they're still worse, but they're not 129th. I don't know that I believe the Penn State's offense or passing game has taken a step forward. Maybe there's certainly belief like in and around State College that it has. I think I might have mentioned last week that there was some train of thought that like Drew Allar needed to throw a pick to learn that the world doesn't end when you do that, and then maybe he can be more aggressive as a result. And he looked more aggressive, I thought, last week against Maryland, threw with 4 touchdown passes.
And what you're talking about, he threw like what seemed like a killer pick against Indiana. And then came back and threw the game-winning touchdown pass on a 50-yard ball down the sideline.
Yes, to win that game. And then he threw 4 touchdowns last week. So maybe there's something there. He's run it a little bit the last 2 weeks. I think and then Drew Allar is the most important part of this conversation. What Penn State also needs is another receiver who's not named Keandre Lambert-Smith to like show that he can do much of anything. Dante Cephas did that last week against Maryland. He had his best game of the year. He was a guy who transferred from Kent State who they had really high hopes for, and it like just had not hit really at any point this year. And then he ended up having a pretty big game last week. I don't know that that means he's ready to roll, and now suddenly Penn State has another receiver it can throw into the mix along with Keandre Lambert-Smith and a couple pretty good tight ends. But they probably are a little better off in terms of having a plan about how they want to throw the ball and how they need to throw the ball than they probably were going into the Ohio State game.
How much does James Franklin need this one? I thought he kind of really needed it against Ohio State, and it didn't happen. I thought there were some questionable, I think everybody did, thought there were some questionable in-game coaching decisions from Mike Yursich as an offensive play caller, from James Franklin about like when to go for it, when to punt, that kind of thing. I think the best version of Ohio State, on point with in-game decisions, Allar being effective throwing it. I think the best version of Penn State has a chance.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that the best version of Penn State will show up in this moment against the most efficient team in college football, I have doubts about. Yep. But how much does James Franklin need that version of Penn State to show up?
As much as he's ever needed it, probably. I don't know. I guess like it's not acceptable, nor is it quite understandable his lack of success against Ohio State. I'm not saying that it should be, but I think it makes a little more sense compared to his lack of success against Michigan. Like they should be more competitive than they have been with Michigan. I think there's probably a case to be made. Like the Penn State recruits better than Michigan, should be more talented on paper than Michigan. I don't think James Franklin's a better coach than Jim Harbaugh, but like at home, I'm not saying Penn State should win this game because of how well Michigan's played. If you can remove that from the equation and just sort of like match up what each of these teams have, I don't know. I can convince myself that Penn State should win this game. It's a pretty close line. So like he needs it. I think losing this game would be up there among the more inexcusable losses that he's had. And he's had a lot of them, right? He's not gotten the job done in these games. So I think he needs this one desperately.
And I think they at least have to compete. They did compete against Ohio State. Like, they didn't get blown off the field. They didn't seize the opportunity.
They never do. That's what makes it maddening. It's like Michigan has actually blown them out more than Ohio State has, I think. Yeah.
No, and like, but I think in the end, I mean, he only has one win against Ohio State in a decade, which isn't enough. But I think showing up and like not being afraid of Ohio State is actually kind of a feather in his cap, and they just never get over the top. And then I think, again, they made some mistakes on decision making in that game. If they get steamrolled, it's gonna be a rough rest of the season in Happy Valley. Like, if they just get flattened the way they did last year. I don't think that will happen. But like, I wouldn't bet on this game. I wouldn't feel good about any kind of prediction in this game because I just don't know what kind of Penn State's gonna show up. I think they have the talent defensively to make it tough on Michigan. And I think, the best version of Allar and, two-headed monster at running back, and you use the tight ends a little bit, I think you can hang. But man, it's hard to like put your reputation on the line with that kind of prediction, given what's happened with Penn State in games like this.
Yeah, it is interesting to me that I think with both of these teams coming into the year, maybe just with their offenses, because Penn State's defense had a lot to like too, but the two things you were most excited about, which each of these offenses, were the running back stables, right? Blake Corum, Donovan Edwards, and then Nick Singleton and Katron Allen at Penn State. And I don't think either group has really lived up to the billing, which is kind of odd that they're in this position at this point in the year. But I think there's so much talent there that either one of them, like if either one of them took off this week, I don't know that I'd be surprised, because we've sort of been waiting to see that happen all year. But you're probably a little more confident in Michigan finding that gear than you are Penn State, I think.